She woke up tasting her own blood. The Arizona sun was a hammer, and she was the anvil. Just hours ago, she'd given birth in the back of a rocking wagon, a brutal, agonizing affair. Now the wagon was gone. Her late husband's brother, Simon, the man who had promised her sanctuary, was gone. The supplies, the water, their meager life savings, all vanished. He had left her for dead in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains. But he didn't leave her alone. A tiny, desperate cry cut through the suffocating silence. Her newborn daughter. He had left her bleeding in the dirt with the child he saw as a burden, a final cruel act in a land that had already taken everything else. This wasn't just abandonment. This was a slow, deliberate execution by heat and thirst. Clementine knew in that jagged, painful shard of light that her life had truly ended. Not when the doctor shook his head over her husband Jedediah's fever, but right now. Jedediah had been a good man, a dreamer who saw fertile valleys where others saw sun-scorched rock. He'd bought a plot of land sight unseen, a place he called Promise Creek, their Eden. But Jedediah's promises died with him, his body broken by a waterborne sickness that didn't care about a man's dreams. That left Simon, carved from a harder, colder stone. Where Jedediah's eyes held the warmth of a hearth, Simon's were chips of cold slate. He'd arrived in Tucson a week after the funeral, all solemn condolences and firm handshakes. "It's what Jed would have wanted," he'd said, his voice a convincing rumble. "Family sticks together." Family. The word was poison on her tongue now. She remembered him rummaging through Jedediah's lockbox right after the birth. She'd been too exhausted, too submerged in a fog of pain to question it. "Just resting my eyes," she had murmured. "You do that," Simon had replied, his voice strangely tight. The next time she opened them, she was on the ground. Alone. He had taken everything. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the haze. She tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through her, and she collapsed back with a groan. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. It was the cry of life demanding to be sustained. Clementine forced herself onto her side, ignoring the tearing sensation inside her, and pulled the bundled infant to her chest. As the child drank, Clementine scanned the horizon. Nothing, just endless plains of scrub brush and the hazy purple of the distant mountains. A guttural sob escaped her, a sound of pure animal despair. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a tombstone waiting for a name. She pressed the baby closer, her small, warm body a fragile anchor in a sea of desolation. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child, the words cracking in her dry throat. "Oh, my sweet girl, I am so, so sorry." She lay there for what felt like an eternity, the sun creeping across the sky, her strength failing. The bleeding was a constant, draining reminder of her body's trauma. Thirst was a living creature clawing at her throat. Soon, the baby would need more from her than she could give. Soon, the crying would stop. And then, a new sound. The soft scuff of a footstep on gravel. Clementine's head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. Was it Simon? Had he come back? Had he grown a conscience? But the figure that emerged from behind a cluster of granite boulders was not Simon. He was tall and lean, with skin the color of burnished copper. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and carried himself with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed part of the landscape itself. His face was stark, with high cheekbones and dark, unreadable eyes that took in the scene with unnerving stillness. An Apache. Every horror story she had ever heard crashed down on her at once. Scalpings, raids, women stolen. Her hand instinctively tightened around her baby. This was it. This was the end. Just a different, more violent version than the one Simon had planned. The man's eyes moved from her blood-soaked dress to the infant at her breast, and for a fleeting moment, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. He took a slow step forward. Clementine flinched, dragging herself backward, the movement sending another searing bolt of pain through her. "Stay back," she croaked, the words barely a whisper. He stopped. He held up one empty hand, a gesture of peace that seemed utterly at odds with the terror she'd been taught to feel. He said nothing, simply watched her, his gaze steady. He was alone. No war party. He seemed as solitary as she was. Minutes stretched into a silent, sun-baked standoff. The baby finished nursing and began to fuss again. The man's eyes flickered to the child. He took another step, then knelt, his movements fluid and unhurried. He unslung a water skin from his shoulder and held it out. Clementine stared at it, then at him. It was a trick. It had to be. A moment of kindness before the inevitable brutality. Yet her throat felt like it was coated in sand. Her baby's life, and her own, depended on that water. Her survival instinct warred with a lifetime of ingrained fear. She looked from the water to his face. His eyes were not cruel. They were weary. There was a loneliness in them that she recognized, a reflection of the gaping void in her own soul. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. He didn't move closer. He set the water skin on the ground between them and slid it forward. Her fingers closed around the cool, damp leather. She drank, the water so precious it felt like a sacrament. She let it soothe her raw throat before giving a few drops to the baby, who quieted immediately. When she looked up, the man was still there, watching. "He left you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He had understood the whole pathetic scene in a single glance. Clementine could only nod, tears finally blurring her vision. The man's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He looked at her not as a white woman, not as an intruder, but as a fellow creature in pain. He saw the blood, the fear, the fierce protective curl of her body around her child. He saw a survivor teetering on the edge of extinction. He rose to his feet, a silhouette against the setting sun. For a moment she thought he would leave, that this small act of mercy was all he had to offer. But he turned back, his dark eyes meeting hers across the growing twilight. "The Chiricahua call this place the land of standing stones," he said, his voice carrying on the cooling air. "It is not a place for a mother and a newborn to die. You will come with me." Clementine shook her head, a reflexive gesture of fear. I can't." He seemed to understand. He knew the stories the white people told about his people. He knew the fear he inspired just by existing. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see an old scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He knelt once more, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Taza," he said. The name meant nothing to her, but he said it as if it should. "My people were taken from me in a place not far from here. I know what it is to be left with nothing." He paused, his eyes flicking again to the baby in her arms. "You are safe with me." The words hung in the air, a promise so profound and unlikely that her mind struggled to accept it. Safety was a concept that had evaporated with Jedediah's last breath. Trust was a currency Simon had stolen and debased. And yet this stranger, a man who should have been her greatest fear, offered both. Taza didn't wait for an answer. He saw the exhaustion that had hollowed out her eyes. He gathered a pile of dry mesquite branches and, with a skill that was both efficient and mesmerizing, had a small fire crackling to life. The warmth was a balm against the sudden desert chill. He disappeared into the rocks, returning with a bundle of leaves and roots. He crushed them between two stones, mixing them with a little water, until they formed a dark, pungent paste. He approached her cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. "This will help the bleeding," he said, holding out the poultice. "What is it?" she recoiled. "Ocotillo root and creosote," he answered simply. "An old remedy. It will clean the wound and help your body close itself." Her mind screamed at her to refuse. To let a savage apply his strange medicine to the most intimate parts of her broken body was unthinkable. But the dull, persistent ache and the knowledge of the life seeping out of her was a more powerful argument. She was dying. Slowly, but certainly. She gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. He was as detached and professional as any doctor, averting his eyes respectfully, guiding her with quiet instructions to apply the poultice herself. The paste stung at first, a clean, sharp fire that made her gasp, but it was quickly replaced by a soothing, numbing coolness. For the first time in days, the relentless pain began to recede. He then offered her food, strips of dried meat, tougher than any jerky she had ever eaten, but full of a smoky, savory flavor that reawakened her ravenous hunger. As she ate, Taza sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of a hunting knife on a wet stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a strangely comforting sound in the vast silence of the desert night. The small fire cast dancing shadows on Taza's face, revealing lines of hardship and grief that the harsh sunlight had hidden. He was younger than she had first thought, but his eyes held the ancient weariness of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "Why are you helping me?" Taza didn't look up from his knife. "My wife gave birth to our son in the winter," he said, his voice low and even. "The soldiers came a week later. They called it the Camp Grant Massacre. To them, it was a victory. To me, it was the day the world burned." He paused, the scraping sound stopping. He looked into the fire, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. They did not leave her bleeding. They left her still. Both of them. The confession was delivered without a trace of self-pity, a simple, brutal statement. It struck Clementine with the force of a physical blow. Her own tragedy, which had felt so immense, was suddenly placed beside a grief so profound it was almost unimaginable. She, at least, still had her child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He looked at her, his dark eyes meeting hers across the flames. "There is too much sorrow in this land," he said. "Adding to it helps no one. The spirits of my ancestors would not forgive me if I left a mother and child to the coyotes." He fell silent after that. She understood now. He wasn't helping a white woman. He was honoring the ghosts of a wife and son he could no longer protect. As the moon climbed high into the inky sky, Taza stood. "We cannot stay here. Your trail is easy to follow." The thought of Simon sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. "He won't come back. He left us to die." "Men like that are greedy," Taza stated, his tone certain. "Greed makes them careless, but it also makes them persistent." He paused, his sharp eyes assessing the scene of her abandonment again. "He took a lockbox." Clementine blinked, surprised. "Yes. How did you know?" "The tracks. The wagon was heavy, then it was light. He did not travel far before he stopped and searched it. He was looking for something specific. If he did not find it, he may think you still have it." The deed to Promise Creek. Jedediah had kept it in a false bottom of the box. Simon knew all of Jedediah's secrets. He would have found it. Unless... A frantic thought sparked in her mind. On their last night in Tucson, Jedediah, weakened by fever, but plagued by an unease about Simon, had made her do something strange. He'd made her take the deed from the box and sew it into the lining of the baby's swaddling blanket. "Just until we're settled," he'd coughed. "A man shouldn't tempt his kin." She had thought it was the fever talking. Now she realized it had been a moment of perfect, prophetic clarity. She looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms. The blanket was coarse wool, but it was now the most valuable thing she owned. Taza was right. If Simon opened that box and found only their savings, he would have torn the wagon apart looking for the deed. When he didn't find it, he would realize there was only one other place it could be. He would come back for it. He was hunting them. "We have to go," she said, a new urgency in her voice. Taza nodded. He extinguished the fire, scattering the ashes until no trace remained. He then came to her and, with a startling gentleness, lifted her into his arms. She was too weak to protest, her body weighing next to nothing. He carried her as if she were a child, his movements sure-footed and silent as he navigated the rocky, moonlit terrain. The baby remained nestled against her chest, her daughter's soft breaths, a steady rhythm against her own frantic heartbeat. They walked for hours, deeper into the labyrinth of canyons that formed the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. Finally, they arrived at a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of desert willow overlooking a small, spring-fed pool of crystal-clear water. It was a perfect, secret place. He gently set her down on a bed of soft furs. "You will rest here," he commanded softly. "You will heal. Then we will decide what comes next." Clementine looked around the small shelter. It was sparse, but it was safe. She looked at Taza, this man who should have been her enemy, and saw only a protector. She had lost a husband, a brother-in-law, and a home. But in the deepest pit of her despair, she had found an unlikely savior. As she finally surrendered to a deep, healing sleep, she allowed a fragile sliver of hope to take root in her wounded heart. Perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps this was a different, terrifying, and altogether unexpected beginning. The days that followed blurred into a routine of healing. Taza's cave was a refuge from the world. He was a creature of ritual and discipline. He would rise before the sun, returning with a rabbit, a handful of edible roots, or fresh water. He showed Clementine how to grind mesquite beans into a coarse flour and bake it into dense cakes on a hot stone. He brought her different herbs for her tea, one to enrich her milk for the baby, another to ease the lingering pain in her body. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were deliberate. He taught her the names of the plants and the animals, the language of survival. In turn, Clementine found her own voice again. She told him about Jedediah, his dreams, and his fatal underestimation of his own brother's darkness. Taza would listen, his face impassive, but his eyes attentive. He never offered judgment, only the quiet respect of his presence. The baby grew stronger, a quiet, watchful infant with a tuft of dark hair and Jedediah's deep blue eyes. Clementine had yet to name her. To name her felt too permanent, too hopeful for a world that had proven so treacherous. One afternoon, as Clementine sat by the spring bathing the infant, Taza approached. "She needs a name," he said. It was not a suggestion. "I know," Clementine replied, her voice soft. "I don't know what to call her. Any name I think of seems too fragile for this place." "A name has power," Taza said. "It tells a spirit where it belongs. My son's name was Goyatle, one who yawns. He was always tired." A rare, faint smile touched his lips before vanishing. "But his name meant he was ours. He belonged to us, and to the people." Clementine looked down at her daughter. What did this child belong to? Born in a wagon and abandoned in the dirt. Her only legacy was a deed sewn into her blanket. "When I thought we were going to die out there," Clementine said, her voice thick with emotion, "the only thing I prayed for was that she would have a chance. That was my only hope." The word hung in the air. Hope. It was everything she had lost, and everything this child now represented. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't fragile. It was fierce and stubborn. It was the mesquite tree drawing water from deep in the earth. Hope, she whispered, testing the sound of it. She looked at her daughter. Her name is Hope. Taza nodded slowly, a look of profound approval in his eyes. It is a good name, a strong name. That evening, a sense of peace settled over Clementine. By giving her daughter a name, she had claimed a future. She had drawn a line in the sand. But their fragile sanctuary was not impervious. A week later, Taza returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. "He's in the town," Taza said. "The one they call Redemption Gulch. I followed his tracks. He sold your wagon and horse." He paused, his eyes hard. "And he is telling people his story." His story. He tells them his poor, widowed sister-in-law, sick with grief and fever, wandered off into the desert with her newborn. He says he has been searching for you for weeks. He is the victim, the worried family man. Taza's lip curled in a silent snarl of contempt. The white folk, they believe him. They offer him whiskey and sympathy. Clementine felt the blood drain from her face. Simon wasn't just a thief. He was a performer. He was weaving a narrative that would make him a hero and her a mad woman. If she were ever found, who would they believe? She knew the answer. "The lockbox," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was found broken open and discarded a mile from where he left you," Taza confirmed. "He is looking for something he did not find. The land deed. He believes you took it and ran." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Simon had established a public identity as the grieving, concerned relative. Now he could hunt for her openly, enlisting help under the guise of a rescue mission. He wasn't just looking for a piece of paper anymore. He was hunting her. She was the only one who could expose his lies. He couldn't afford to let her and Hope live. The hidden cave, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The world was shrinking, and Simon Stokes was drawing the circle tighter and tighter. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more an open wound on the landscape. A single dusty main street flanked by a dozen sun-bleached, weary buildings. It was a place for men chasing rumors of silver and for those running from something back east. It smelled of dust, manure, and cheap whiskey. Simon Stokes felt right at home. For 2 weeks, he had patiently cultivated his persona. He'd tacked up a hand-drawn picture of Clementine, a flattering one making her look doe-eyed and frail, with a notice offering a $20 reward. He spun a tale to Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt, of his sister-in-law's postpartum delirium. "Her mind just snapped, Sheriff," Simon said, his voice laced with practiced sorrow. "Grief over my brother, the hardship of the trail. She just started babbling about devils in the rocks and ran off with the babe before I could stop her." Sheriff Brody, a man who preferred simple explanations, nodded sympathetically. "A terrible business, Mr. Stokes. A woman's mind is a delicate thing." But Simon wasn't relying on the law. He was relying on the greed of other men. He let it be known in quiet conversations over cards and whiskey that Clementine might be carrying something of value. "My brother's papers," he'd say vaguely. "Deed to a piece of land. She probably doesn't even know what it is, poor thing." He'd found the perfect allies in a pair of brothers, Walt and Earl Pembroke. They were hard, vicious men run out of Texas for cattle rustling, precisely the kind of men who understood that a deed was worth more than a $20 reward. "You find her," Simon told them in the alley behind the saloon, "and the reward is yours, plus a bonus. Just bring her and the baby to me, and the blanket she's wrapped in." Walt, the elder and smarter of the two, narrowed his eyes. "What's so special about a blanket?" "Sentimental value," Simon lied smoothly. "Last thing my mother knitted. It belongs with the family." Walt and Earl exchanged a look. They knew a lie when they heard one, but they didn't care. The lie meant the blanket was worth something, and that was all that mattered. Simon's frustration was a gnawing thing. He had underestimated Clementine. The thought that she was still out there, a living testament to his crime, was a constant irritant. And the deed was everything. Promise Creek wasn't just some random plot of land. An old prospector had told Jedediah the secret. The creek on that land ran year-round, fed by a hidden aquifer. In Arizona, a permanent source of water wasn't just valuable, it was a kingdom. With that deed, Simon could control every ranch and mining operation for 50 miles. He could become a king. His performance in Redemption Gulch served a dual purpose. It provided an alibi and a network of eyes. He had turned the entire territory into a search party. His break came from an old trapper named Peterson, who came into town, a man who noticed things others missed. "Saw something queer up in the foothills of the Chiricahuas," he mentioned to the bartender, who promptly fetched Simon. "What did you see?" Simon asked, sliding a coin across the bar for a bottle of whiskey for the old man. Peterson took a long swallow. "Tracks, a woman's boot print, small, and moccasin prints alongside 'em. An Apache's, by the look of the stitching." Simon's blood ran cold. An Apache. He had assumed she was alone. This changed everything. It made her more dangerous. "Could be she's a captive," Sheriff Brody suggested when he heard the news. "Exactly," Simon seized on the explanation. "He's taken her. My God, the poor girl. We have to get her back." He turned to the Pembroke brothers, who were lurking by the door, his eyes alight with a new, vicious fire. The narrative had shifted perfectly. Clementine wasn't a madwoman anymore. She was a captive, a victim. And he, Simon Stokes, would be her righteous rescuer. No one would question what he did to the Apache. And in the confusion of a rescue, no one would be surprised if the poor, traumatized woman and her sickly infant tragically didn't survive the ordeal. "They're heading east of the Standing Stones," Peterson grunted, pointing on a crude map. "No sane man goes there unless he knows the way." "We're not sane men, old-timer," Walt Pembroke grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. "We're motivated." Simon threw a heavy pouch of coins on the table. "That's your motivation. There's more when you bring me my niece in the family blanket." He watched them ride out, their dust mingling with the setting sun. For the first time in weeks, Simon felt a genuine smile spread across his face. The hunt was on. Clementine could run, but the story he had crafted would run faster, poisoning every well and turning every stranger into a potential enemy. She and her savage protector were utterly, hopelessly alone. For Clementine, the world had shrunk to the size of the hidden cave. But Taza's news about Simon had shattered her fragile peace. "We need supplies," she said to Taza one evening, her voice firm. "My milk is enough for Hope now, but soon she will need more. And I need a proper dress, not these rags." It was a terrible risk, but the alternative was to remain hidden forever, slowly starving as winter approached. Taza was silent for a long time. "The town is a place of lies. For you, it is dangerous. For me, it is death." "I know," she said, her resolve hardening. "That's why I have to go. You've taught me how to be careful." He finally gave a single reluctant nod. "You will not go alone. I will take you to the ridge overlooking the town. I will watch. If there is trouble, you will signal." He handed her a small polished piece of obsidian. "If the sun is out, flash it twice toward the west peak. If not, find a way to make smoke. I will come." "They'll kill you," she breathed, horrified. "They will try," he said, his voice flat. It was the most confident and most terrifying thing she had ever heard him say. 2 days later, they made the journey, arriving at the ridge as the town below began to stir. Clementine bundled Hope tightly against her chest in a makeshift sling Taza had fashioned from a soft deerskin. She took a deep breath and began the descent. Walking into Redemption Gulch felt like stepping onto a stage. Every sound was magnified. She kept her head down, her sunbonnet pulled low to shadow her face. Finity's general store was a dim, cluttered space. An old man with wire-rimmed spectacles stood behind the counter. "Haven't seen you round here before, ma'am," he said. "Just passing through," Clementine mumbled, gathering her items. A small bag of flour, salt, and a bolt of sturdy brown cloth. As he was tallying the cost, the store's bell jingled. A woman entered, broad-shouldered and dressed in a severe black dress. Henrietta Gable, the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief gossip. Mrs. Gable's sharp eyes swept the room and landed on Clementine. They narrowed first at her worn dress, then at the deerskin sling, and finally at her face. "You look familiar, miss. Have we met?" "I don't believe so," Clementine said, her voice tight. Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered down to the baby sling. "That's an unusual carrier. Is that Indian work?" The question was a poisoned dart. Clementine could feel the blood draining from her face. Mrs. Gable looked at Clementine's face again, a flicker of recognition dawning in her eyes. It was the face from the poster, the poor madwoman. But this woman didn't look mad. She looked scared. "You're the one," Mrs. Gable breathed, her voice a mixture of shock and accusation. "You're Stokes' sister-in-law." Clementine's heart stopped. She dropped the coins on the counter, grabbed her bag of supplies, and turned to flee. "Wait," Mr. Finity called, but it was too late. The bell on the door jingled wildly as Clementine burst back out into the harsh sunlight. Mrs. Gable was right behind her, her voice shrill. "It's her, the lost woman. Somebody get the sheriff. Somebody get Mr. Stokes." Panic gave Clementine wings. She ran, clutching Hope to her chest. She could hear shouting behind her, the sound of running feet. The entire town was now aware of her. Her lungs burned as she scrambled up the rocky path leading out of town. She risked a glance over her shoulder. 2 men, the Pembroke brothers, were following, their long legs eating up the distance, and behind them, emerging from the saloon, was Simon. His face was a mask of theatrical concern, but his eyes, even from this distance, glinted with triumph. He had her. Clementine pushed herself harder, reaching the ridge, gasping for breath. Taza was there, his face a grim stone mask. He had seen it all. "They are coming," he said. The Pembroke brothers were already halfway up the slope. Taza grabbed her arm. "This way, quickly!" He led her not back the way they came, but along the ridge toward a treacherous-looking spine of rock. It was a path no sane person would choose, but it was their only choice. As they disappeared into the labyrinth of stone, Clementine looked back one last time. Simon was standing at the base of the ridge, pointing up at them, his mouth open, shouting instructions to the men giving chase. The serpent was out of his hole, and his fangs were bared. The whisper of the world had become a roar, and it was hunting them down. The chase was a desperate, lung-searing marathon across the treacherous ridges. Taza moved with an agility that Clementine, burdened by the baby and her own limits, could not match. But he never left her behind, surging ahead to scout the path, then doubling back to pull her over ledges. "Don't look down," he commanded. "Step where I step." Sensing her mother's terror, Hope began to wail, her cries echoing off the canyon walls, a perfect beacon for their pursuers. "Give her to me," Taza said urgently. Clementine handed the sling over. Taza secured the baby to his own chest, and Hope, soothed by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, quieted almost immediately. Freed of her burden, Clementine could move faster. Behind them, the shouts grew closer. "There they are, by the split pinnacle!" Walt's voice boomed, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A chip of rock exploded from the cliff face, inches from Clementine's head. They were being herded, pushed toward a dead end. Taza realized it at the same moment. He stopped at a fork in the trail. One path led up into a box canyon, a natural trap. The other led downward into an open, exposed canyon floor. "They expect us to go up," Taza said, his mind working with lightning speed. "To trap ourselves, we will do what they do not expect." He veered onto the downward path. It was a gamble, offering no cover, but it was a direct route toward a dense thicket of cottonwood trees, a half-mile distant. They burst out of the narrow trail and onto the canyon floor, terrifyingly exposed. Another shot rang out, kicking up dust at their heels. "Run!" Taza yelled. Clementine ran as she had never run in her life. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Taza's left arm. He grunted in pain but didn't slow. They were halfway to the trees when Earl Pembroke, faster than his brother, appeared on a ridge to their right, cutting off their angle. He dropped to one knee, taking careful aim. There was nowhere left to run. Taza shoved Clementine behind a meager outcrop of rock, shielding her with his own body. He laid Hope, still quiet, in a small crevice. Then he unslung the old but well-maintained Springfield rifle he carried on his back. He had only a few rounds. He would have to make them count. "Stay down," he ordered. The first shot came from Earl Pembroke. The bullet slammed into the rock near Taza's head. Taza didn't flinch. He took a steadying breath, raised his rifle, and fired. The sound was deafening. Earl cried out and clutched his leg, his own rifle tumbling down the rocks. He was out of the fight. Walt Pembroke, seeing his brother fall, let out a roar of rage from his position behind them and began firing indiscriminately. "Go!" Taza shouted, pushing Clementine toward the cottonwoods, now only 100 yards away. "Get to the trees." Clementine scrambled from one rock to another as Taza laid down covering fire. As she reached the edge of the thicket, she saw a new figure appear at the mouth of the canyon. Simon. He wasn't running. He was walking with a calm, deliberate pace, a pistol in his hand. His face was no longer a mask of concern. It was twisted with a cold, predatory fury. Taza saw him too. He was caught between two fires. "Clementine!" Taza's voice was sharp, a commander's voice. "In my saddlebag, the Colt." She ran to his horse, tethered just inside the trees, her fingers fumbling with the leather straps. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a heavy Colt peacemaker. Jedediah had taught her to shoot, but she had never aimed a gun at a man. Her hands shook as she pulled back the hammer. Simon was closing in on Taza's position. "Give it up, Indian," he shouted. "Give me the woman and the kid, and I'll let you bleed out in peace." "The woman is not yours to take," Taza yelled back. "She's family," Simon sneered. "And this is a family matter." He raised his pistol and fired. Taza cried out as a bullet grazed his ribs. He stumbled, his rifle clattering on the ground. He was hit again, and badly. Seeing Taza fall, Simon stood up, a triumphant grin on his face. He began to walk toward the fallen Apache, his pistol aimed at Taza's head. Now, about that deed. This was it. Clementine's world narrowed to the V-shaped sight at the end of the Colt's barrel. This was the man who had left her to die, who had murdered her in his heart, and was now about to murder the only person who had shown her kindness. This was not a man. He was a monster. She rested the heavy barrel on the branch of a cottonwood tree to steady her shaking hands. She took a deep breath, just as Jedediah had taught her. She let it out slowly, and she squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the explosion shockingly loud. Simon stopped dead. A look of complete surprise washed over his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his shoulder. He staggered, his pistol falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He wasn't dead, but the fight was gone from him. From the ridge, Walt Pembroke, seeing his employer shot and his brother wounded, decided the pay wasn't worth his life. He fired one last angry, inaccurate shot before scrambling back the way he came. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of Earl Pembroke and the frantic pounding of Clementine's own heart. She ran from the trees, the Colt still smoking in her hand. Taza was on the ground, propped up on one elbow, his face pale from blood loss. Hope, tucked safely in the crevice, was beginning to cry. Clementine rushed to Taza's side. "Are you?" "I will live," he grunted, pressing a hand to his side. He looked past her towards Simon, who was now on his knees, clutching his shattered shoulder. "You shot him." "Yes," Clementine said, her voice trembling but clear. Their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted. She was no longer just the woman he had rescued. He was no longer just her protector. They were partners. They had fought together. They had bled together. They had survived. She walked over to where Simon knelt, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. She stood over him, the woman he had discarded like trash, now the arbiter of his fate. "It's over, Simon," she said, her voice devoid of hatred. There was only a vast, cold emptiness. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with frustrated greed. "The deed, Clementine. Just give me the deed." She looked back at Taza, then went to her crying daughter, scooping her up from the crevice. She held Hope close, her fingers touching the coarse wool of the blanket, feeling the stiff parchment sewn within. This was her daughter's birthright. A new beginning, a promise. "You will never have it," she said to Simon. Then she turned her back on him and walked away, back toward the man who had told her she was safe and who had helped her find the strength to make that promise true. Vengeance was a luxury they couldn't afford. They looked down at Simon Stokes, a pathetic figure kneeling in the dust. Killing him would only anchor them to this place. Instead, they took his horse, his pistol, and left him to the mercy of the trail and the town he had deceived. His story, like his shoulder, was shattered, and that was justice enough. The journey back to their hidden cave was a testament to their new reality. Taza, weakened by his wounds, leaned on Clementine for support. The lines between rescuer and rescued had vanished, replaced by the simple, profound truth of partnership. In the quiet days of his recovery, their shared silence spoke volumes. They were bound not by words, but by the blood they had spilled and the life they had saved. It was Taza who broke the silence first. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "We go to your Promise Creek." They traveled north, leaving the ghosts of the Dragoon Mountains behind. With each mile, the weight of their ordeal seemed to lessen, replaced by a cautious optimism. After weeks of travel, they crested a ridge and looked down upon a valley so green it stole their breath. A vibrant creek lined with cottonwoods cut a silver path through the land. It was real. It was their future. Clementine slid from her horse, walking with Hope in her arms to the water's edge. She knelt, dipping her hand into the cool, clear stream. This was the place Jedediah had dreamed of, but she would be the one to build a life here. Taza stood beside her, his gaze taking in the sheltered land. "Promise Creek was my husband's name for it," she said softly. "But it feels like it needs a new one. For us." Taza looked from the life-giving water to the child in her arms. "In the language of my people, a name should tell a story," he said. This place gave us sanctuary when the world offered none. We could call it Safe Harbor Creek. Clementine looked at the peaceful valley, at the steadfast man beside her, and at her daughter, Hope. The name settled over her heart, a perfect fit. Safe Harbor Creek, she repeated, the words feeling like a vow. Here they were, no longer a widow and a warrior, but pioneers at the start of a new story in a place that finally felt like home. The story of Clementine and Taza is more than just a tale of survival in the unforgiving West. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to find strength in the deepest despair and family in the most unexpected of places. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. They were two outcasts, a woman betrayed by her own blood, and a man haunted by the ghosts of his people, who found common ground in their shared humanity. Their journey shows that sometimes the lines society draws between us are meaningless in the face of true character and honor. If their story of resilience, courage, and the forging of an unbreakable bond moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories like this. Share this video with someone who appreciates epic historical drama. And most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have many more tales from the heart of the Old West to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.